We got the United States in the war. We got Eisenhower leading the armies. We got the United States having taken over North Africa. Now, next, we'll talk a little about Japan. The war against Japan was directed by General Douglas MacArthur. There was a Navy man named Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz. Douglas MacArthur directed the Army. At the beginning of the war, the United States broke the Japanese code and we broke the German code, which basically meant, folk, that we could listen in to all the Japanese radio conversations that they thought were carefully encoded. We could listen in to all the Japanese radio communications and know where they were and where they were going and figure out what their plans were. And this gave us a decided advantage. Now, when I was in the Army, I was in the Camo unit, and I can tell you something about our Army. It changes its code every day. So if the enemy happens to get today's code, by tomorrow there'll be a whole new code. The Japanese and the Germans made the mistake of using the same code throughout the war. In the case of the Japanese, when they abandoned one of their islands, they left their codes buried in the sand on the beach. And we happened to have some metal detectors, something. Anyway, we found that their code boxes all neatly packed up for us, waiting for us. We dug them up and listened to our conversation. In the case of the British, I don't know how we got their code. We got, not the British, the German, we got the code of the Germans, and we listened to the German communications all throughout the war.
Didn't the British back in Germany?
What's that?
The British?
The British had some excellent men called cryptographers who could crack codes pretty well. And they had cryptographers, and some of these cryptographers wound up after the war cracking the ancient Greek. The Greek language is not really in code, but they cracked some of the ancient languages. And the same thing has since been used to crack the Mayan language. You can decipher a language if you get enough documents. But anyway, folk, here's something I want to tell you about the German code. This might sound, offensive to some, but here's the way it happened. We were listening in on the German code and knew the Germans were going to bomb a certain British town. The British leaders decided they were not going to warn the inhabitants of that town because it would let, you've heard the story?
Yeah.
They would let the Germans know that we're in on their code, the Germans might change their code, so we allowed that town to be bombed. About 50 or 60 years later, the British released the documents showing that they knew that a certain town would be bombed, and the relatives, the people who were killed, said, "You mean you let my daddy be killed and you didn't tell me?" Hey, folk,
It's war.
it's war. That's all I can tell you, it's war. Now, if the question is, well, what if they found that the enemy was going to bomb Metro Atlanta and didn't tell me? Again, folk, it's war. Do you like what I'm saying? If you don't, I got something to tell you. I don't like it either. Now today, all right, in World War II, we won the war. Today, we're fighting wars. World War II, yes.
What page are we
I'm looking at page 741 right now. I mean, what I'm saying is not in the book.
on?
No, but except to just tell you what war is like. We won World War II by fighting a little bit dirty. After World War II, we started trying to fight clean wars. We went to Korea and couldn't win. We went to Vietnam. World War II, we got into 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, but 1945 it's over. Went into Vietnam, and I'm old enough to remember it. 1962, 1963, 1964, 1965. Are you getting tired? We did too. 1966, 1967, 1968, 1969. Yeah, getting tired. 1970, 1971, 1972, 1973. Suppose we signed a peace treaty with them. 1974, 1975. They overran us. We lost. Our present war got in 2001.
How about the Gulf War? That only lasted 6 months.
Yeah, two. Gulf War, we actually went in and bombed them to smithereens in the first Gulf War.
That's true.
Afghan War, got in 2001, 13 years later.
Still there.
We're still there and can't win. All right, I hope they're making a point. Something Leo DeRocher, baseball manager of the 1950s, said, "Nice guys finish last." All right. Anyway, just something I thought I'd throw in. At least one of you heard the story I gave about the code breakers. But anyway, we were in under code. It helped us. All right, I'm moving on to page 742. After capturing North Africa from the Germans and forcing the German army to surrender Tunisia, we sneaked into Sicily, attacked Sicily. Now, about 40 years ago, there was a movie made called Ike, which I happened to copy when it was released later. And in this movie, Ike was staying in a news conference, and he was not telling the press much of anything. Finally, when the president said, "Come on, General, give us a break." So Ike just opened up and gave out the whole plan. But the press people knew that if they released it, they'd be executed for treason. And it said these pressmen are now afraid to fall asleep, afraid of talk in their sleep. But nevertheless, in spite of the fact that Ike had given the press the whole plan, when Ike made the attack on Sicily, the attack was a complete surprise to the Germans. The American army went up through Sicily, then went into Italy. The Italian people did not resist. In fact, the Italian people began to defect over to the American soldiers and basically turn on their own government, looking on the American soldiers as liberators. Make a long story short, 2 days before Hitler committed suicide, the Italians shot Mussolini dead, hung him upside down like an animal, and hung his mistress. Now, you might ask what happened to his wife. Nobody hated his wife. She survived and lived a good many more years, about 22 years after her husband. Again, she was innocent of her husband's crime. And it says, for the mistress, somebody said, "Now, come on, we know how we can sneak you out. You don't have to die with him." And the mistress said, "I love him. I'm going to die with him." She was shot dead along beside him and hung upside down like an animal along beside him. Now, again, if you look, they don't show these kind of pictures anymore, but when I was younger, they'd show these pictures of him and his mistress hanging upside down, having been executed. Again, it sounds kind of gross. As for Japan, I'll get back to Europe a little bit. MacArthur began taking the islands back one at a time, beginning with the island of New Guinea. And if you just look at a map of the Far East, and there is one, on page 740. He started off at New Guinea, and then went from New Guinea through Borneo. The idea was to get as close to Japan as possible. And the closer he got to Japan, the more bombs his planes could carry, and the less fuel they'd have to carry, of course. We began bombing the Japanese islands, and at first they were bombing from China. But we kept getting closer and closer. Eventually we got the Philippines back. Now when MacArthur left the Philippines in February 1942, he said, "I shall return." Well, he did return. But when I was a kid, some of my classmates used to make fun of it. Yeah, he returned after the Marines had already been there first and made things nice and safe for his return. But return he did. He came back to the Philippines bragging, "I have returned." He got the Philippines back. Then they went on toward Okinawa. Now I want to talk on a personal note here. When I was a youngster, I went to this church camp, and my counselor had been to Okinawa. He told us the thing about Okinawa. Okinawa was the last island we went to before the invasion of the Japanese mainland. The American troops who went to Okinawa first, all were either killed or so badly wounded had to be taken out of the war. This man was a replacement troop. And he was in Okinawa when the Japanese surrendered shortly after he took over, after the United States took over the island. Japan surrendered, but he was training for the march on Japan itself, for the amphibious landing on the island of Japan, which in all probability he would not have survived. Keep that in mind, folks. That's what I'm about to get into in a little bit. The attack on Japan, had it been made, might very well have cost us the lives of 1 million servicemen, and keep in mind we only lost 250,000 during the entire war. Not to mention the possibility the attack might have cost the lives of some 3 or 4 million Japanese. We were dropping heavy bombs on the Japanese. Bombs that were incendiary bombs were so bad that sometimes if a person survived the blast, they would die of suffocation because the flame of the bomb would soak up all the oxygen out of the air, and persons would suffocate for lack of oxygen. We did the same thing to the Germans. The atomic bomb, some of you may have heard about, that comes later. Anyway, we were bombing the Japanese heavily. The Japanese simply would not surrender. And they began to resort to a type of fighting known as kamikaze, or suicide missions. That is, where their pilots would be told to just load your plane up with ammunition and fly straight into an American ship and blow yourself, your plane, and hopefully the ship up. And when the American soldiers, those American sailors, first saw kamikaze planes coming at them, what is going on? Because unlike a normal plane that would turn around after firing a few shots, these planes kept on and kept on coming. They weren't firing anything. Then they realized, hey, these are suicide bombers. Now, fortunately, the kamikaze attacks were largely ineffective. It's now known that a lot of the pilots were heavily drugged or stoned out drunk and could not think clearly and could not aim very clearly. It's also known, found out later, that these aircraft were hard to steer, but we found that out too late because, or they found that out too late because nobody ever returned. A lot of the planes just wound up landing harmlessly into the water and destroying only the plane and the pilot. A few of them hit their targets, though, and did some damage to American shipping, but not that much. Anyway, that was Japan's last desperate attempt to try to find some way to win the war. All right. The big turning point in the war perhaps was the Battle of Stalingrad. And here is again, folks, where Hitler made one of his blunders. His army, well, first of all, his army wanted to turn back after the first winter, saying, Mr. Hitler, our tanks will not operate, our machinery will not operate in this 30 below zero weather. We can't, our engines stall. Please, and also the ones that don't stall, we can't get them started once we stop them. Please turn back. Now, that was before the days of electronic ignition. Today, most of your cars, I hear, would probably start in 30 below zero weather. Not that any of you ever tried it, but a lot of cars today will. But in those days, they wouldn't. His army wanted to turn back, and Hitler said, no, we're not going to turn back. We're going to stay there and fight to the last man. In addition, the army had wanted to take over the oil fields of the Crimea. Yes, the Crimea was making news even then. Hitler said, no, I think we ought to take Stalingrad first. The generals were probably right. Hitler went on to Stalingrad and lost badly. Your book has a little vignette about a German soldier at Stalingrad. One of you, I think, pointed out they wound up eating horses, but the people inside were eating rodents. Unfortunately, every attempt the Germans made to supply their troops, almost all the stuff they dropped from the air fell down behind Russian lines. Oftentimes, when the men were wanting food, a box of medical supplies would drop down instead of food, which the men might have needed, but it wound up the Soviets got most of it. And then when they tried to send stuff by truck, the Soviet troops would capture the trucks, and the Soviets then would have a big meal out of food that was meant for the Germans. So most of the supplies that were meant for the German army wound up in Soviet hands. Ironically, I once heard of a big box of stuff dropping down from the sky that actually landed in the German lines. When the Germans opened it up, it was nothing but a big box of contraceptives. And they wondered, how did this get here? I can tell you how it got in there. The people were packing, just didn't care what they're packing, just found something to pack and shoved it in, and the plane took off with it without even checking what it was. And the result was, I mean, this can happen in a bureaucracy sometime. What got to the front lines did not benefit the German soldiers in the least bit. Your book shows some pictures of the terrible destruction of Stalingrad and of the German prisoners of war who had once been on parade in Berlin with their bright new uniforms and everything highly shined and all the brass highly polished. The prisoners are a completely sorry lot with nothing hardly to look forward to except starvation and deprivation and more cold. And most of the German prisoners died in the prison camps. Again, because most of the Soviet prisoners who had been taken died in German prison camps. These people did not take very good care of their prisoners, starved them to death or let them die of disease, allowed plagues to break out among them, and did not do anything to stop it. All right. Here is one date, folk. I want you to remember, you'll be hearing about this probably later. The date is June 6th. Now, this day is called D-Day. Now, throughout history, there have been a lot of D-Days. The word D in the military means this is the day we attack. That's just like hour, H-hour is the hour we attack. But we don't remember the hours so much as we do today. On a personal note, when I was in high school, I checked out a book about D-Day and read it, turned it back in. It was a library book. 50 years later, my daughter was going through some books for a homeschool project, and I had to look at them and copy the same book. But we know a little bit more than we did then. This book was written about 1957. The book I checked out. We now know a lot more about what happened on D-Day because we've gone through some of the German documents. But essentially, on that day, we opened up a beachhead on France where we attacked Normandy Beach. We had been wanting to open up a beachhead on France and open up a second front for a long time. Now, it was a risky move because Hitler had put up a bunch of barbed wire. Well, I'm going to draw a diagram. I mean, like, here's the water, here's the English Channel, then you have the beach coming up, and then right on the other side of the beach is some cliffs. On the top of the cliffs, the Germans set up some barbed wire, dug some trenches, and Hitler said, my Atlantic wall can never be broken. We've got it, it's impenetrable, can be broken. Also, keep in mind, the enemy who got off the ship, because the ship's going to come in so far, the enemy who got off the ship would have to wade this water. And then come the beaches, which were wide open and exposed, they'd be exposed, and then somehow scale the cliff to get up here to the barbed wire all the time while the enemy was shooting at them. Sounds like a formidable task, almost impossible. Now, again, the year was 1944, and on every year that ends in the number 4, come June 6th, I guarantee you there'll be big write-ups in the newspapers about it. There'll be there'll be a TV documentary about it. Guess what, folks? This year ends in number 4. 70 years ago this June. And a lot of times they'll take some of the men back. Now, these men are now getting kind of old, and some of them are having health problems. But they'll take these men back and say, you remember being here, and all the ones who still have their mind, their wits about them can remember, yeah, I was here. They'll tell about it. But anyway, this was the plan. Now, 3 countries participated in the invasion: the United States, Great Britain, and Canada. The British and the Canadians had a really simple plan of action. Just simply, folks, you just disembark off the ship and wade up and get as far as you can inland. And hopefully you'll get far enough to where we can send more reinforcements in later. We'll come back to another ship and offload. Simple. That plan actually worked best. Now, the Americans, being Americans, had a more complex plan. They were going to go through and drop a bunch of bombs first on the beaches that would create craters where that would hide the troops as they came offshore. And supposedly the bombs would soften these positions right here, destroy some of the barbed wire. Then they were going to land a bunch of paratroopers behind the enemy lines, and the paratroopers were to go in and get these people from behind. And then they would offload some very heavy equipment, some tanks that could barely get above the water. I mean, just barely, about like a foot above the water line. And bring in a few heavier pieces of artillery also on some of these tanks. And then finally get the infantrymen in after all this had happened. All right, everything in the world that could go wrong with the American plan went wrong. The bombers tried to bomb the beaches at night. They couldn't see the beaches, so they had to bomb by instrument. And in those days, that was very, very iffy. The bombers wound up bombing way back here and frightening a few cows in cow pastures and letting the enemy know that, hey, something's going on. Now, this actually happened. As for the paratroopers, in the darkness, I mean, they had to pick a dark night. You know, it was a night with no moon. Well, the paratroopers wound up getting lost from each other, I mean, coming down from the dark sky. And then they tried to regroup, and they found that the person who they called out to was not their buddy, was some stranger, but at least he was an American. So they all had to kind of regroup and look around and say, now, who ranks highest among us? And okay, you be your leader, you're the highest ranking person. And they had to fight alongside strangers, but with all due respect, they did regroup, and they did soften some of they did distract the Germans a little bit. Then as for the tanks, a big wave after wave started coming up that wound up sinking almost all the tanks. As for heavy pieces of artillery, they tried to get 24 pieces up with the initial wave, and only one piece of artillery actually made it. So when the troops arrived, the infantry troops, they found the beaches as smooth as ever. There were no craters on the beaches. And it just looked like, oh, we're sunk. For some reason, hard to explain, the Americans just simply got to right and said, hey, well, we're going to fight, and they just started to advance. But they didn't know there were some places along this beachhead that were undefended, particularly where the British and Canadians landed. The Germans hardly had a man in some places. But something else went wrong on the German side. Your book says that the Germans were not quick to respond. Here was a problem. The problem was Mr. Hitler himself. Adolf Hitler had told the German commander, now don't you use any of the panzers until you've called me first. Well, the German commander was sitting at his desk that night. He was not sleeping, and he had not been born yesterday. He was receiving reports. Now again, if you're in an army, so you know what to do. I mean, one thing you're trained to do is report what's going on to your commanding officer. So let's say you had been looking out over the ocean, and you heard a bunch of motorboats coming at you. Well, your first duty, report that to your sergeant. Your sergeant came out, oh yeah. The sergeant reported the captain. The captain got on the phone and called the colonel. The colonels were calling the general, and the general was receiving all these reports all up and down the line of activity. He knew he was being attacked. No doubt about it, he knew it. So he got on the phone to call Adolf Hitler. He was told, all right, Mr. Hitler will get to you as soon as you can. Hitler had gone into his room and said, now don't anybody disturb me until I come out. Leave me alone. And he picked that morning to sleep in. It is known that if the Germans had committed their panzers, the outcome of the battle would probably have been different. Instead, Hitler slept in. When Hitler finally came out of his room, everybody jumped at him once, shouting at him at once. Hitler calmed, quiet, and said, all right, listen, all you dumb cops, I don't want every one of you shouting over. I want one of you to give me one report when I come back out. Now, in the meantime, leave me alone. I turned around and went back into his room. By the time he came back out, it was early afternoon. Someone handed a report. Oh, okay, we're being invaded. He ordered the panzers at that point. It was too late because by that time, the initial wave had come in, the ships had gone back, loaded up another wave, and they'd come in. But with the second wave, though, they found some places where that the Allies had already taken hold on the beachhead, so they were able to get their equipment, their troops off the shore without being fired at. Then the third wave had even more. By that time, we had our heavy tanks in position. It was too late. Well, there were a few places along the line where Hitler's troops were able to win. So Hitler told the German people, the enemy has attacked us, but we have repelled, which was partly true. Unfortunately, it was not altogether true. The Allies just kept pouring in places where they had taken hold of this. For the British and Canadians, by the time the first day was over, they had gotten 6 miles inland. Again, just a simple way. All you mean is get off the ship and take what you can, get as far as you can go, and we'll come back, we'll send replacements for you. Which the British did. They went back to England, loaded up more troops and supplies and sent them in. By the end of the day, the Canadians and British were an average of 6 miles inland. And the Americans were still struggling and wondering, hey, what went wrong with their paratroopers? What went wrong with their bombers? the plan was a little bit too complicated. All right, I'm going into detail there, but keep in mind, June 6, 1944, the day that we opened up the beachhead on the front, and then we began pushing the Germans out of France. In short order, Paris was liberated. Paris was liberated. We went on in, and when I got to the Rhine River, when we got to the Rhine River, we crossed the Rhine, and the American Army and British and Canadian Army was now in Germany, something that did not happen at all in World War I. But Hitler said to his people, now most of you I think have heard that the enemy has gotten inside our territory. Hey, don't let it bother you. We have some super weapons which will take care of them. It is known that the Germans were working on the atomic bomb. They developed a rocket plane, the V-2 rocket. The super weapons did exist. They also had jet aircraft, but again, the problem with the jet aircraft, the bugs, it took a year after they got the first one assembled to get the bugs out. Any of you who have ever tried to put together anything complex knows it almost never works the first time you put it together. You have to go through and figure out what's not working about it and eventually get the bugs out. The problem with the jet aircraft is they came a little bit too late.